everyone, we're going to get going. So my name is Jane Huckabee. I direct the International Human Rights Clinic here at the Law School, and it's my great privilege and pleasure to be hosting this event today and moderating our discussion. So the event today is Human Rights Advances During COVID-19. The event is part of the Human Rights in Practice series, co-convened by the International Human Rights Clinic and the Duke Center on International Comparative Law. I'm particularly delighted to be having a discussion today because as human rights advocates, we're very good at identifying violations, right? Of being really clear about when governments are falling short of their obligations with regard to pandemics. And while it's very important because many governments continue to violate a multitude of rights during COVID-19, at the same time, there are a number of ways in which governments began to do things that we had been told for a long time they wouldn't do or couldn't do, that was necessitated by the pandemic and all that has unfolded. And what our discussion today will be doing is really highlighting these human rights advances over the past 2 years, in particular by focusing on a new tool developed by the International Human Rights Clinic entitled Catalyzing Rights, a new index of these advances around the world and all levels of government. But really, again, the goal of doing this is to not only provide an accountability tool, so when governments may seek to roll back these advances they've made, but also to be more forward-looking, like to, rather than constantly critiquing, identifying violations, think about what a more right-centric vision might be as we move forward. Those are quite ambitious goals for our discussion and for our project, but we're really looking forward to having a chance to explore these issues today. And to do that, we are joined by 3 speakers, and each speaker will sort of talk for around 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions, and we look forward to an engaged conversation during that period. Our order of speakers will be, first of all, Professor Aya Fujimura-Fansalo, who is Clinical Professor of Law Teaching and Supervising Attorney at the Duke Law International Human Rights Clinic, and has been the lead on our Catalyzing Rights website. Second speaker is Amanda McRae, who is presently Director of UN Advocacy at Women Enabled International. And our final speaker is Kanyo Pereze, who is the Africa Advocacy Officer at Outright Action International. We have a sincere and deep apology from Sam Freeman, who is the Research Director at Make the Shift, who, due to a last-minute emergency, was not able to join our discussion, but remains an extraordinary supporter of the project that you'll be hearing about more. And we, again, are grateful to his support and use of our tracker. We also, just a final note from me before we actually go to the core of our discussion, we also have live tweeting of the event by our colleague Monica Aya, who's a clinical fellow in the International Human Rights Clinic. You can follow the hashtag Catalyzing Rights to see that you're also here. So you don't need to do that, but if you want to somehow engage in that discussion, you can do so as well. But that's all from me and Professor Fujimura-Fansalo.
Great. Well, thank you all again for being here. We're so excited to be finally on this day launching this tracker that we've been working on since the summer of 2020. I'll spend a little bit of time sharing my screen so that you can take a look at the tracker itself. But I wanted to say a little bit about that before getting started. First, just such an enormous thanks to the more than 20 clinic and advanced clinic students, as well as some summer RAs since the summer of 2020 that have worked on this tracker project. Among other things, your work, for some of you who are here, has involved identifying, researching, and analyzing hundreds of measures extensively from countries all over the world. It has also involved reviewing a wide scope of human rights laws and norms from different countries, and interviewing representatives of civil society groups. Throughout, these students have been extremely thorough and careful, demonstrated such excellent research skills, exhibited adaptability in researching measures globally and from widely differing legal systems in different languages, been creative and imaginative and just overall incredible. It's been such a joy to work with them. And I wanted to name those who are still at Duke, and some of whom are here today: Andrew Barsom, Trinae Felician, Gabby Jasser, Tom Murphy, Jane Tian, Sherry Zhang, and Zijun Zhao. So thank you to all of these students and so many others for doing all the work that made this tracker possible. As a brief overview, this tracker, Catalyzing Rights, currently contains more than 200 measures across 20 different categories of human rights. These categories include civil and political rights, equality rights, governance rights, and socioeconomic rights. I'd like to take a moment now to share with you all a screen of what the website currently looks like. So at the bottom of the tracker, you'll see all of the categories of rights. Again, these are 20 different categories in a range of different main topic areas. Just as an example, I'm going to pull up employment, which takes us to a page first showing the relevant sources of international human rights law on which protect the right to education. We then go into different core elements of the guarantees of the right and additional guidance. And here we have the list of all of the measures, including the title of the measure and the country. Also to note that there was enormous effort on the part of students to actually locate primary sources, primary laws, policies, decisions, executive orders from countries to ensure that we were really going straight to the source and confirming that these are measures that were put in place by governments. We found, for example, that media sources might portray a right as being positive, but that when we actually read the measure itself, it was not necessarily positive. And so a lot of effort was put into finding these primary sources so that people who access the website are able to then go straight to the source and find the language with respect to the law or measure, including in their original languages. There's a lot to explore on this website, so I won't go into everything. We also have here a Submit a Measure tab, and this is very much an important element of the tracker in that we envision it as being something that's participatory and evolving. And so we ourselves as a clinic will continue to add measures over time. And we will also be reviewing measures that people send in through this function and reviewing these to see if they might be worth adding to the website as well. And so I really want to emphasize what a central element of conceptualizing this website is something that people can actively participate in. I will stop the share for now. So going back a little bit, I also wanted to say a few words, which Professor Huckabee also alluded to, about why we decided to take on this project in the first place. The pandemic has really uncovered many of the human rights violations that individuals and communities globally have been suffering and facing always. Not only that, the pandemic has additionally provided cover for further violation of rights, often under the cover of public health protections. We've seen, among others, restrictions on freedom of association, increased evictions, lack of access to healthcare, and disproportionate and intersectional impacts of the pandemic on particular groups, whether persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, LGBTQ individuals, or racial and ethnic minorities. Yet despite all of this, on the other hand, we've also seen examples of governments, from the most local to the national levels, putting into place measures that not only protect rights, but even go a step further in advancing these rights. We very much conceptualize this tracker as a way to identify and celebrate these positive measures. And as mentioned, we specifically decided to create an online and interactive website, for example, in contrast to a report, to ensure that catalyzing rights can evolve over time with additional measures added and additional briefing papers analyzing these measures added over time as well. Our broader goals for the tracker include the following. One is to really promote government accountability. We envision very concretely that, for example, an activist or human rights advocate in Nepal will see a measure that the government of Bangladesh has put into place and model some of their own advocacy with policymakers and government officials around measures from similarly situated countries. By actually equipping activists and civil society groups with examples of concrete good practices that have been implemented, we hope to contribute to their advocacy goals. Additionally, more broadly, we hope that our tracker encourages us to imagine what a world that puts human rights at its center looks like. Over and over again during this pandemic, we've actually seen examples of governments put into place the very measures that they have said were impossible to implement. We see now that by prioritizing certain rights, governments actually can do this. Additionally, we hope that our tracker expands and even transforms the strategies through which human rights advocates approach their work to focus more heavily on emphasizing good and best practices rather than only focusing on criticizing bad measures. And finally, in a very concrete way, international human rights law contains the principle of what is known as non-retrogression, which prohibits, especially with economic, social, and cultural rights, such as the right to housing, health, education, water, and sanitation, prohibits governments from rescinding human rights measures. By maintaining a database of measures that are currently in place, we hope to be able to hold governments accountable if and when they do rescind any of these measures. And finally, a quick note on the methodology that we used in this project. To determine which measures to include in the Catalyzing Rights Tracker, we engaged in a rigorous process of reviewing international human rights treaties and guidance from human rights bodies, international institutions, and NGOs. We wanted to be sure that we had fully examined and analyzed any measures before making a decision to include them. And we still very much believe that there is work to be done, both in improving the measures that we've included in this tracker, and additionally for more governments at all levels to continue to implement positive measures in the pandemic and beyond. With that, I would like to turn it over to Amanda. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aya. And just give me a moment to share my screen with you all, which will mean that I won't have to be quite as big of a face, nor will anyone else on this call on the screen that you're seeing there. So hold on just a moment. So great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda McRae, and as Jane said, I'm the Director of United Nations Advocacy at Women Enabled International. And just a quick note, I am also a Duke Law alum, class of 2009. I've been trying to figure out what room you all are in. I'm pretty sure it's when I had civil procedure and when I was a 1L. So hello to all of you, and it's great to be connected to Duke Law again. So the organization I work for, Women Enabled International, works to advance rights at the intersection of gender and disability worldwide, and particularly to try to get human rights standards to reflect the lived experiences of women, girls, and gender minorities with disabilities around the world. We do this in partnership with women-led organizations of persons with disabilities in countries throughout the world, as well as with feminist and disability rights actors in different spaces. So we're an international human rights organization and use those kind of legal advocacy skills to advance our objectives. And when the COVID-19 crisis really began to hit in early 2020, we pivoted some of our standard UN advocacy work to focus on the response to that crisis instead. So let me give you a little background on kind of the work we did in that regard, some of our findings, and then I'll talk to you about some of the good practices we documented in response to the COVID-19 crisis too. So back in March and April of 2020, we conducted a global online survey to which we got 100 women and gender nonconforming persons with disabilities responses, again, from around the world, about the impact of COVID-19 on their lives, and specifically on issues related to violence, sexual and reproductive health and rights, as well as related rights such as access to employment, education, support services, and so on. Following a publication of a report based on that survey in May of 2020 and many other advocacy efforts, we at Women Enabled partnered with UNFPA, which is the UN Population Fund, UN Women, and 7 women-led organizations of persons with disabilities from around the world to do a set of more in-depth research into the situation of this group, and then to produce some resources to help address the situation as it proceeded. And that included an additional 300, actually more than 300, women, girls, and gender nonconforming persons with disabilities, advocates in this space, and family members of those groups. What our research found was that measures taken to address the COVID-19 public health crisis in many countries, really in most countries, had a disproportionate impact on women and girls with disabilities specifically. The reason for that impact varied a lot. Sometimes it was an impact primarily based on their gender. Sometimes it was an impact based on disability, and sometimes it was intersectional. So for instance, women and girls with disabilities reported a heightened risk of encountering violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. A big part of that risk was that they were suddenly lost access to any support services they had outside of their home and to community outside of their home as well. And people within their home had to suddenly take on many of those support services and the, quote unquote, burdens of ensuring that people with disabilities could meet their basic needs. That was a situation for all persons with disabilities worldwide, but was exacerbated for women and girls because of a gendered expectation that they are the caregivers, that people don't give care to them. And so this created additional tensions within households that led to emotional violence, physical violence, and so on. Furthermore, many women and girls with disabilities faced increased barriers to accessing sexual and reproductive health, information, goods, and services. Now, this is the case for many women, girls, and other people who needed those services around the world. But the situation was particularly stark for women and girls with disabilities, who even before the crisis had much less access to sexual and reproductive health information, goods, and services like contraception, maternal health care, abortion, so on, even leading into the crisis. And then finally, things like access to support services for persons with disabilities to help meet their basic daily needs or to interact with the community really vanished during this crisis, were not considered essential services, and the people who did them weren't considered essential workers. People with disabilities faced many increased barriers to accessing their employment, whether it was in person and they didn't want to go because they had comorbidities that made them higher risk for COVID-19, or because it moved to virtual platforms that it's taken really a while to figure out how to make accessible. Same thing with education and the switch over there as well, which really has created many long-term impacts for women and girls with disabilities in their lives too. From this research, we developed a number of resources to both learn about the impact of COVID-19 and then for states and others to try to begin to address that impact. The first I mentioned earlier was a report published in May of 2020 by us. And then the second was a series of 5 resources developed with UNFPA and UN Women, including a compendium of good practices, which I'm about to tell you about in just a moment. But you can find all of these resources on Women Enabled International's website, which you might be able to see here. It's not great color contrast, so my apologies for that, but it's womenenabled.org. So one of the resources that we decided to put together as part of this project was a compendium of good practices. We wanted to look into what states, UN agencies, NGOs around the world were doing well to try to address the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on women, girls, and gender minorities with disabilities. When we undertook this work, we were looking for 3 characteristics, at least 3 characteristics in these good practices. The first was that the practice would address an identified need. So it wouldn't just be a practice developed based on what government thought might be going on for women and girls with disabilities, but was actually something that they looked at, studied, and found there was a specific need for this service or for this intervention in that context. The second thing that defined a good practice was that women and girls with disabilities were actually included in the design, the implementation, and or the monitoring of the practice, preferably all 3, because they were bringing the perspectives from their communities and from their own lives into informing how the practice went. And then finally, and very importantly, the practices themselves from the beginning were designed with human rights obligations and standards in mind, and were put in place to promote the dignity and rights of women, girls, and gender minorities with disabilities. So our compendium has a whole long list of good practices within it, including 9 practices that we really delve into and provide much more detail about. Now, I would love to say that governments around the world did an amazing job of ensuring the rights of women, girls, and gender minorities with disabilities during this crisis. But the fact is, we really had to dive deep to find good practices implemented by states in this context. We interviewed many state actors about this and really could not get them to look at the intersection of gender and disability. Many of them had done something for women, they had done something for persons with disabilities, but really had not thought about this intersection in a robust way. But a few of them had, and I do want to talk with you about those. One is in Tajikistan, where the Ministry of Health of Tajikistan, UNFPA, and OPDs, that means Organizations of Persons with Disabilities in Tajikistan, got together to talk about how the COVID-19 crisis was impacting persons with disabilities, and particularly women and girls with disabilities around the world, around the country. And then one thing that they identified was that there was a lack of sexual and reproductive health service providers that were available for women and girls with disabilities during this time. That was for many reasons. One was that many of the SRH, as we call them, service providers, were located in urban areas, and there was no longer accessible public transportation available for women and girls with disabilities, particularly during lockdowns and other restrictions on movement, to get from rural areas to urban ones. Another was that the sexual and reproductive health service providers that did exist were mainly located in facilities where COVID-19 was also being treated, which meant that going to those facilities potentially put people with disabilities at risk of contracting COVID-19. We saw around the world that people with disabilities had much higher rates of severe illness and death from this crisis as well. And so the hope was we need to address the problem of getting sexual and reproductive health services to still be provided to this community without putting them at risk. So the solution that these actors came up with was that they established 5 rooms dedicated specifically to sexual and reproductive health services throughout the country, in urban and in rural areas, based in specifically accessible places, including with organizations of persons with disabilities offices around the country that would be dedicated solely to providing screenings for reproductive cancers, provision of contraceptives, and counseling and support for gender-based violence during the crisis for women and girls with disabilities. The result was that as of between September and December of 2020, nearly 500 women with disabilities had received care at those facilities. There had been some reproductive cancers caught in the early stages. Contraceptives had been given out to many women in that context. And the program has only expanded since then. I was speaking with a representative from UNFPA Tajikistan a couple of weeks ago, and they've managed to expand the number of rooms that they had put in place, and the number of women with disabilities who've received care in those rooms has quadrupled since December of 2020. So it's really been a good and interesting effort to get the word out and services to these individuals. I'd also say that UNFPA and the Ministry of Health and the OPDs are working together to expand beyond this particular COVID-19 specific measure. As part of the work that they did in establishing these 5 rooms, they also determined that many providers in Tajikistan of sexual and reproductive health services do not have training on disability rights, do not know how to provide respectful care to persons with disabilities. That's not based in stereotypes and stigma. And so as an additional step of the project, they're now working together to develop trainings for sexual and reproductive health service providers on this kind of respectful care and on disability rights in this context. So they've managed to kind of expand this partnership beyond the COVID-19 crisis as well. A second good practice that we documented as part of this work came out of Indonesia, where kind of the problem was just a broad need to ensure the intersection of gender and disability was included in the COVID-19 response, and that rights at this intersection were not systemically violated. For this good practice, the Ministry of Women Empowerment and Child Protection worked with SAPTA, the Center for Women, Disabilities and Children Advocacy, which is an NGO in Indonesia. And what they did is they developed a national policy on inclusion of women and girls with disabilities in the COVID-19 response. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but this is literally the only policy we could find of its kind anywhere throughout the world, the only one that specifically targeted this group. The content of the policy was strong. The policy looked at wanting to prevent and treat COVID-19 for women and girls with disabilities and making sure they had access to the PPE and services they needed in that regard. It also anticipated and provided protection measures against gender-based violence and access to justice measures should gender-based violence occur during the crisis. And it recognized that women with disabilities might be isolated in their communities and provided guidance on how to ensure their inclusion in the community life during the COVID-19 crisis so that they were not isolated. But in reality, despite the kind of strength of this national policy measure, at the local level, there was quite limited uptake. And one reason for that is that local officials from the Ministry of Women Empowerment and Child Advocacy did not have the intersectional lens to bring to their work on the ground. So they were given a policy to implement, but didn't really know what to do with it, didn't know that they need to be prioritizing this group, which is 1 in 5 women worldwide, and is a significant portion of the population. And so they just neglected to actually put the policy into practice in many respects. I said most of the good practices we were able to document actually came from organizations of persons with disabilities themselves, meeting their own needs. And I wanted to highlight one of those for you briefly. It comes from an organization called Plena Inclusión, which is based in Spain. It's a self-advocacy organization of persons with intellectual disabilities and has a women with disabilities specific group within the organization that meets together and does advocacy on issues important to them. They instituted a gender-based violence social media campaign to raise awareness of the fact that gender-based violence against women with intellectual disabilities was increasing during the crisis and to get people to pay attention to this phenomenon. They did it through a hashtag, Voy tapada no callada, my mouth is covered, not shut. My apologies for my Spanish pronunciation there. A social media filter that included a mask with that hashtag, and an online protest where advocates from all over the country got together, talked about the issues of importance to them, and staged a virtual protest on this issue. They also worked with a larger organization of women with disabilities in the country to translate a document about gender-based violence during the COVID-19 crisis into what's called easy read format, a format particularly accessible to women with or persons with intellectual disabilities, and a good way to get information to that group. Again, as of December 2020, when we did the research with this group, they had engaged more than 6,000 people in the campaign. So just very briefly, and then I'll stop talking to conclude about some of the work we've done on this crisis and where we see there's still room for improvement moving into future emergencies. One thing we saw that could have helped prevent many of the impacts we saw in this crisis was if states and others had actually integrated existing global guidance on crisis response into their crisis preparation, response, and recovery. In particular, in 2019, there was a set of guidelines issued on ensuring the inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action that anticipated, it was an international set of guidelines that anticipated almost everything we documented during the COVID-19 crisis. But pretty much no one had actually had the opportunity yet to integrate that guidance into their crisis response, which meant that most of the provisions of that were ignored. That's why I think something like the Catalyzing Rights Tracker could be really important because it provides kind of an easy to access and a collated way of getting at some of that guidance, getting at some of that information on what's gone well during a crisis or how people can respond to a crisis in a way that respects rights. I think that was really missing at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis. And so I'm really glad that we have a resource like that now. A second thing we'd like to see happen in advance of future crises is to actually include women and girls with disabilities in planning, implementation, and monitoring of crisis response, but also ahead of crises and during crises as well, is getting these voices involved, because that's the way that the issues that most impact them will get addressed. And then finally, there's really a need to ensure the long-term fulfillment of rights at the intersection of gender and disability. So much of what we saw was the result of the fact that women and girls with disabilities were much more marginalized than many other groups because states had not prioritized the fulfillment of their rights up until that date, both because of their gender and disability. And that's why, in many respects, the impact of the crisis was disproportionate for them. So thanks, I will leave it there and hand it back over to Aya and Jane.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda, for that extremely comprehensive overview and the detailed outline of those country examples. So our next speaker is Kanyo Fereze, and as mentioned, Kanyo is with Outright Action International. We're delighted to have you here. If you don't mind speaking just for around 10 minutes, so we have time to ensure that a number of questions that I anticipate we'll be talking through. But thank you very much in advance.
Thank you so much. Good evening from Johannesburg, South Africa. I hope my screen is now showing.
Yes, perfect.
Great. I will do my best to stay within the time provided and hopefully even use much less. So as the speakers introduced me, my name is Kanyo Fereze, and I am here in Johannesburg, South Africa. I am an advocacy officer for Outright Action International. Outright was founded in 1990. Its headquarters is based in New York. We are a leading NGO that is dedicated to improving the lives of people who experience discrimination and abuse based on their sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. We do this through strengthening the capacity of LGBT human rights movement actors. We do this by documenting violations as well as engaging in advocacy. We work at the UN level as well as through regional human rights mechanisms and also with our civil society partners. So to get straight into it, I'll quickly just talk about the overview of this. I'll look at the context in which COVID hit Africa and highlight some of the impacts. And then we'll look at the question of whether there were, in fact, any human rights advances during the pandemic. And if so, what do they look like? And which other advances were made? And those ones that were made, how could they go further? And which are the glaring gaps that need to be responded to by states in this regard? So briefly, the context, I think, can be very nicely summarized with the sentence that in Africa, the usual threats to the rights of LGBT persons combined with the impact of COVID-19 pandemic means that there is a disproportionate socioeconomic impact on LGBT persons who are already in a disadvantaged position. So as we all know, many countries, in fact, more than 50% of the countries on the African continent criminalize consensual same-sex sex. And also countries were also at different stages in their developmental, legal, and political agendas. So for example, in Eswatini, there were pro-democracy protests. Eswatini is the last remaining absolute monarchy in Africa. And so there have been these pro-democracy protests, which have resulted in many human rights violations, including killings of protesters and the like. As we may know, also in Ghana, there has been the introduction of a bill called the Promotion of Proper Sexual Rights and Ghanaian Family Values Bill, which is probably the worst piece of proposed legislation I've ever seen. It really tries as far as possible to deepen existing inequalities that LGBT persons faced in Ghana, and actually even touches on diaspora. So in Botswana, as we know, the case of decriminalization of same-sex activity was had recently, and it's only the second decision from an apex court in Africa to decriminalize. In Uganda, we've heard about the arbitrary arrests and raids, including in homeless shelters where LGBT persons exist, and the continued persecution of LGBT persons in Uganda. South Africa similarly had many arbitrary raids and arrests, as well as looting and destruction on the margins of other political crises. And I'll just mention Tanzania, Mozambique, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Eswatini, all had reported cases of police brutality. And this was done in the guise of enforcing COVID-19 regulations. So the impact, again, quite briefly, I think this has been documented quite widely, both in the UN level as well as various NGOs internationally and locally have shown that there has been a devastating impact on people's livelihood. In Africa, many people work in the informal sector, including many LGBT persons in particular who do, for example, work in car washes, hair salons, and the like, photography, and so on. Very insecure work environments. And of course, this was impacted by COVID. There was a lot of disruption to healthcare access, which was already for LGBT persons was already quite strained. For example, access to HIV-related healthcare services, as well as gender affirming health services was severely disrupted as they were deprioritized and COVID was prioritized. Again, we've heard about the hostile environments where, for example, women were under lockdown. LGBT persons faced a lot of violence, including conversion practices where people were made to eat herbs, preyed upon, raped, forced to marry, etc., as part of trying to change them to be heteronormative. And of course, in these hostile environments, people were significantly exposed. Of course, many cases of gross violations by state actors, abuse of power, arbitrary arrest, especially in countries where there is where same-sex sexual activity is illegal. It was really, and LGBT persons couldn't even report to police that they've encountered these violations because, of course, they would end up being the people arrested. Lots of stigma in South Africa. Very high rates of hate crimes where murders of LGBT persons really was at very shocking levels, and unfortunately it still continues to happen. Of course, LGBT organizations also faced crises of not being able to continue to work in this context. So with regard to any sort of advances in this space, for example, the independent expert on protection based on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression has highlighted that indeed LGBT persons have faced a significantly disproportionate impact of this of this pandemic, and also that some of the respondents, some of the responses have continued to increase this this problem as opposed to fixing it. So overall, there has been not enough. There are far too few state responses when we talk about LGBT persons in particular. Like I think Amanda mentioned, many responses have been more by civil society, ensuring, for example, LGBT organizations and persons have access to mental health facilities, providing COVID relief, food parcels and other funds and various other methods which organizations have put in place. And I'm not going to go into those. I'll just speak about state responses because those are very few and far between. And I think that's the common thread that's been mentioned by all the speakers today. So as we may recall, in Uganda, there was a raid and arrest by the police of an LGBT homeless shelter where the police just came in, raided the people, locked them in jail for over 40 days without giving them access to their lawyers, and of course violating various other rights, including torturing them and all other forms of violence that they were faced with. So then this matter was taken to court, and the court actually ruled. And for you guys, I'm sure you think this is normal. This should have been done. How is this an advancement? But this is significant in the context of Uganda, that the courts held the state accountable for the violation of the rights of these LGBT persons, including by awarding them monetary compensation. And also insisting that the state had various other options other than to violate the rights of these persons. So that was a rare example of a Ugandan court actually protecting, or rather the state through the court protecting LGBT persons. Another example I will share is here in South Africa. South Africa had put in place a COVID relief package, but this package excluded refugees and asylum seekers. So many of them face starvation. And in South Africa, so then the government denied these refugees and asylum seekers. Of course, many of them include LGBT persons, because many people leave different parts of the continent to come to South Africa because they seek asylum, because they've been discriminated against or experience violence in their home countries based on their sexual orientation. So there is a huge amount of the community that is part of these refugee processes. So an NGO based in Cape Town took the matter to court urgently and indeed held the state accountable for excluding and discriminating against these persons. And thankfully, the court held in favor of the NGO, saying that the government needs to make sure that this response includes asylum seekers as well as LGBT persons. So that meant that now these persons could access these COVID relief funds. What measures are in place that need to do better, that could have gone further? The African Commission on Human People's Rights, which is basically a human rights institution Africa-wide, has got a resolution that specifically speaks to protection of the rights of LGBT persons. This was seen as a milestone in light of already the hostile environment of the African continent. But this commission has not done enough. For example, it specifically wrote to South Africa demanding protection of the rights of vulnerable groups, and it lists refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. But it could have included LGBT persons, especially in light of the hate crimes that are persistent in South Africa. Again, here, the African Union has issued, for example, AU guidelines on the gender response to COVID-19. This guidelines say nothing about LGBT persons. And so it's not comprehensive, and it specifically excludes issues which could be contained or should be contained. Special mechanisms, including the Special Rapporteur on Women, similarly have issued statements, called for action, but have excluded LGBT persons, and that could have been included here. Insofar as national responses are concerned, in South Africa, our government, for example, has said we need to include more, ensure more shelters, especially also for LGBT persons, but this has not been practicalized. It has not been put into effect. Shelters have been increased, for example, for women, but they have not made measures to ensure that also LGBT persons have access to these shelters in a way that is non-discriminatory. Access to justice is something that's very lacking. There has been efforts to ensure that victims of gender-based violence have access to justice, including mobile courts and various other creative strategies. But LGBT persons are in urgent need of services which can make access to justice a possibility, especially in the context of hate crimes, which are at very high levels in this country. Inclusion of LGBT persons in decision-making, I think Amanda mentioned that one as well, and also sensitization and awareness raising. Our government and various governments on the continent did specific things to say, hey, this group is vulnerable, make sure they're protected. But LGBT persons were not included in some of those campaigns. So the glaring gaps, I think I'll quickly mention that I think the tracker is a very exciting tool. I was so very happy to see it. And I think it raises many questions for me when I looked at it, because, for example, the tab on LGBT measures has a lot of information from a variety of different countries, but there's not enough on Africa, if anything. And that makes me ask questions of why is that? Of course, it's because of the context we are in, but also what specific things do we need to do, certain types of advocacy? What do we need to do to make sure that governments actually, at least there's one or two measures we can refer to and say that our governments have in fact put in place. And glaring gaps is that people are literally dying consistently and every day because of violence, both by state and non-state actors. And so, as I mentioned, the hate crimes is at a very high level, and issues around conversion practices, which include lots of forms of torture, discrimination, and have a severe impact. And these practices continue, especially in the context of these lockdowns. And there's an urgent need to have practical responses to these. And unfortunately, there are none. For example, there are countries who have specifically banned conversion practices and put in place legislation. In Africa, we do not yet have that. So we need to change the laws, and especially those that criminalize, because those are laws that encourage all forms of violence against LGBT persons. And also, even when they suffer discrimination and violence, they cannot approach the authorities for relief, because there are these laws which are in any case going to end up having them arrested. So also there's a lot of work that is being done to perpetuate anti-gender ideologies. So, for example, I've mentioned the bill in Ghana. There are various other bills that are, mushrooming in different parts of the continent. And there's an urgent need to push back against that misinformation and all of the really terrible laws that we're seeing. Sorry?
Would you mind? I'm sorry to be a little bit mindful of the time. Is it possible if we can leave this?
This is my last slide.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, these glaring gaps I won't go into, and I think that everybody has seen these well-documented issues in various reports, including on socioeconomic issues and also specific protections. On our side as Outright, we will continue to do work especially focused on data collection of what these violations look like, and then we'll do advocacy on them, and in particular around the issue of conversion practices. That is something that we're really continuing to work on. But with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
And thank you to all our speakers. And I apologize, I've been WhatsApping and asking speakers to wrap up. There's so much incredible information, and I want to thank you both, and to, of course, all three of you for your information today. So I have one question, but I think what we might do, and given the timing, is collect a few questions and then get the speakers to have a chance to respond to those. So my question to start us off is, really reflecting on Kanyo's question about, why aren't the measures for Africa? Really reflecting on the fact that all speakers amplified that governments, by and large, are violating rights, right? So how do we actually go about developing criteria for what even looks like a positive measure? And how do you balance the risks that potentially, in doing so, you may actually be seen to be sanitizing a government's record on COVID, right? So if governments are doing a lot of really bad stuff and we point out the good thing, how do we avoid ensuring that gets used to bolster a government in the regard? So we'll come to that, but maybe another few questions, and then we'll have a chance for our speakers to respond. Other questions? Yeah, sure.
So I had a question. A lot of these measures were implemented in kind of an emergency state, and so to what extent is the principle of non-retrogression useful when there's also this emergency temporary situation?
Great. Any other questions before we go back to our speakers? Yeah, Sisha.
So I saw that WI has a checklist for states, so I'm just curious if you both have any suggestions of how to engage states and other state actors in this post-pandemic world.
Great. And Joe?
Related to the first question, I'm wondering if the positive measures are not up to the standards of human rights, how do we still acknowledge that it's a positive step, but that is still not in accordance with human rights law? And then kind of related to that, does it factor, I know it's about like showing positive measures, but is there any efforts to track backsliding during COVID.
Great. And Andrew?
Yeah, this is a question for Panyo. I'm wondering if there are any other places, other regions in the world that maybe have similar cultural challenges with LGBT issues that that you've seen that have made some positive steps during COVID-19 that maybe activists and advocates on the African continent could really employ and use in their advocacy locally.
Great. That's a very rich set of questions. So let's go back to our panelists, and I invite everyone to reflect on generally on those questions or any particular directed questions. And then if we have time, we will take another round of questions. Professor Fischer-Consoy, do you mind starting us off?
Yeah, that'd be great. So I'll focus in particular on the related questions from Professor Huckabee and from Joe. And so thinking about, this goes a little bit to our methodology, but particularly given that we as a law school are putting out this tracker, we wanted to be certain that we were fully grounded in international human rights law. And so as a preliminary step, this involved literally going through the 9 core international human rights treaties, provision by provision, to first really understand what are the basic protections for human rights under international human rights law. From there, we then turned to guidance from different UN institutions, regional bodies, and NGOs. So in particular, at the UN level, there were quite a few independent experts and other special procedures who put out guidance about what it looks like to put in place human rights positive measures during the pandemic. Since Sam Freeman wasn't able to be here today, he works on the right to housing, including with the former special rapporteur on the right to housing, Leilani Farha. And Leilani in particular put out a series of 5 guidance notes on the right to housing during the pandemic on issues including evictions, homelessness, financialization of housing, and informal settlements. And so we very much drew on these documents and reports and guidelines from these special procedures. Also, I wanted to highlight what Kanyo said in terms of some of the lack of, for example, intersectionality in some of these guidance documents put out by these rapporteurs, which we also very much noticed. And so to address that, we read a lot of these reports in conjunction with one another, so that combined, we were seeing ways in which they were actually holistically addressing a range of rights, including from an international perspective. Again, some of the other documents we looked at were from regional human rights bodies, from the European system, the Inter-American system, and the African system, and also from NGOs as well. Integrating your question, Joe, we also really wanted to be certain that there was a nexus between the measure and human rights. So we saw, for example, particularly with environmental justice, which Sherry worked on, that there were measures that we would consider positive, but they were very much aimed at improving the economy of some countries who were losing tourists because of environmental degradation. And so we wanted to be sure that the measures that we included on this tracker had a very specific and direct link to human rights, whether that meant that there was explicit language in the measure about the right to X, or whether it was clear from the context that that was part of it. We also, as both speakers have noted, wanted to pay attention to the way in which these measures came into being. So, for example, were they based on consultations with civil society groups to really integrate the perspectives of those affected? And I'll just make a final note in terms of the regional balance, which Kanyo also brought up, is that we were also very intentional about trying as much as possible to include measures from all regions. As the students who worked on this will know, for every category, the task was specifically to find at least one measure from every region. And there were, exactly as Kanyo noted, occasions when we literally were not able to find that. And so that's something that I think we'd definitely like to continue to work on to make sure that there is regional representation, and when there isn't, to really understand what that lack is coming from.
Thank you for that. And just to note, I've heard from speakers that they couldn't entirely hear the questions. So I'm going to just summarize what I think is left, like in the package of questions. So for Amanda or Kanyo. So some reflection on, if possible, around what has been good practice on engaging states, right? Where has it been? Where can you see examples where states have responded to advocacy on these issues? Sort of relatedly, are there any examples of positive steps on LGBTI rights outside of the Africa context, maybe that Kanyo that you have seen that could be addressed? And also, reflecting, I think it was a little bit, Sherry's question was tied in, already partly responded to, which is, these are positive measures during an emergency, right? Like during these moments of heightened, concern in governance. And how do we sort of think about that, right? Like, how do we think about the longevity of then those measures as different countries are in different stages of the pandemic? So if any of our speakers can reflect on those outstanding questions, then we'll be wrapping up with our discussion. Thank you both in advance. Amanda, would you like to go first? Yeah, thank you.
Sure, I'll go ahead. Thanks for repeating those. That was very helpful. In terms of engaging states on some of these measures, one thing that we saw that ended up being effective for a lot of organizations of persons with disabilities is actually working through a UN agency that also served as kind of like a bridge between the state and the DPO or OPD on the ground. Increasingly, UN agencies are prioritizing disability and gender in their work, and some of them, like UNFPA, are doing so intersectionally. And because UN agencies are often funders of both governments and NGOs, they can be kind of a bridge between the two. So for instance, the good practice that I described out of Tajikistan was really UNFPA serving as a bridge and connecting an organization with a disability on the ground to the Ministry of Health to try to identify what the kind of health needs and rights issues were and come up with solutions that address the issue. In terms of longevity, I think the Tajikistan also serves as, they're a star example in many respects of how we can turn some of these practices targeted specifically at the COVID-19 crisis into a potential long-term measure. By establishing this relationship between the Ministry of Health and organizations with disabilities on the ground and seeing the impact of the accessible rooms that they established to address sexual and reproductive health needs during the crisis, the Ministry of Health realized, hey, I think there's more we can do. There's a need here that we need to address, and we have these established partners now who can help us address it. So they're turning those accessible rooms not just into a COVID-19 response measure, but into a long-term measure to address these needs and going the next step, providing training on disability rights and on the needs of persons with disabilities in the context of sexual and reproductive health to the SRH service providers to ensure that those services are more accessible, are provided on the basis of human rights in the future, well beyond the COVID-19 crisis. And that's going to help women and girls with disabilities, not only when the next crisis comes in Tajikistan, but for the long term. So we were excited to see that as it has played out. And again, it's one of the very few measures we were able to document in that regard, but it is one that we're really excited about.
Thank you, Amanda. And then we'll finish. Kanya, you have the final word.
Thank you. Quite briefly, in terms of long-term measures, some of the cases, including the ones I mentioned today, of course, happen within a context of COVID-19. But in these cases, specific arguments around, for example, the Siracusa principles and non-retrogression, and if rights are taken away, or rather limited, that needs to be in compliance with the law. Those kind of precedents in our context are very important, and we will use them because in many of our cases, we have an incremental approach where we use previous litigation in order to, argue for further rights going forward and to support other cases. Insofar as examples of other gains, I'll say firstly, in Africa, we do have some gains. Like I mentioned, the Botswana decriminalization, there are lots of freedom of association wins. There are pockets of wins, but there's just not enough of them, and they are not COVID related. But the index or the tracker has really good examples from other countries around the world and not Africa. So I think that would be a first point of call to see some examples that work elsewhere. Thanks.
Well, thank you to all of our speakers for that incredibly enriching conversation. And as we mentioned, it's the beginning of a long conversation, an ongoing conversation as we utilize the COVID tracker, the Catalyzing Rights tracker, and really do build upon this expertise around identifying positive ways of navigating our current environments. Again, thank you to our speakers and thank you to everyone here and online.